Acts 23, verse 12. The next morning, some Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves with an oath not to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. More than 40 men were involved in this plot. They went to the chief priests and the elders and said, "We have taken a solemn oath not to eat anything until we have killed Paul. Now then, you and the Sanhedrin petition the commander to bring him before you on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about his case. We are ready to kill him before he gets there." But when the sons of Paul's sister heard of this plot, he went into the barracks and told Paul. Then Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the commander. He has something to tell him." So he took him to the commander. The centurion said, "Paul the prisoner sent for me and asked me to bring this young man to you because he has something to tell you." The commander took the young man by the hand, drew him aside and asked, "What is it you want to tell me?" He said, "Some Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul before the Sanhedrin tomorrow on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about him. Don't give in to them, because more than 40 of them are waiting in ambush for him. They have taken an oath not to eat or drink until they have killed him. They are ready now, waiting for your consent to their request." The commander dismissed the young man with this warning, "Don't tell anyone that you have reported this to me." Then he called 2 of his centurions and ordered them, "Get ready a detachment of 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at 9 tonight. Provide horses for Paul so that he may be taken safely to Governor Felix." He wrote a letter as follows: "Claudius Lysias, to His Excellency Governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews and they were about to kill him. But I came with my troops and rescued him, for I had learned that he is a Roman citizen. I wanted to know why they were accusing him, so I brought him to their Sanhedrin. I found that their accusation had to do with questions about their law, but there was no charge against him that deserved death or imprisonment. When I was informed of a plot to be carried out against the man, I sent him to you at once. I also ordered his accusers to present to you their case against him." So the soldiers, carrying out their orders, took Paul with them during the night and brought him as far as Antipatris. The next day they let the cavalry go on with him while they returned to the barracks. When the cavalry arrived in Caesarea, they delivered the letter to the governor and handed Paul over to him. The governor read the letter and asked what province he was from. Learning that he was from Cilicia, he said, "I will hear your case when your accusers get here." Then he ordered that Paul be kept under guard in Herod's palace. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Thanks very much, Jeanette. Morning, all. I hope you're not too disappointed that it's me instead of Tom, but it's okay. I can handle it. Courage is defined as the ability to control your fear in a difficult and dangerous situation. That's courage. And in the last verse that we looked at last week, the verse just before our passage today, the risen Jesus said to Paul, "Take courage." And I've been thinking about Jesus' words to Paul all week, because as I look at Paul, he looks like the one person who doesn't need that kind of encouragement. As we've seen Paul's way of life, as you see him making Christ known in Acts, you could arguably call Paul one of the most courageous people ever. Certainly one of the most courageous Christians ever. And as we've worked our way through Acts, maybe Paul has inspired you. Maybe what he's said, what he's done has been an encouragement to you as you seek to make Christ known. Great. I think it's also possible that seeing Paul in Acts might leave us feeling a little bit discouraged, deflated, defeated. Because we see Paul out there proclaiming the truth about Jesus. He goes everywhere. He tells everyone about Jesus, even when it's dangerous or deadly to do so. And I'm here in a country where I can live for Jesus quite easily, where I can speak about Jesus freely, without fear, anytime I like, to anyone I like. But I find it a challenge to even open my mouth to say a single word about the hope that I've been given in Jesus. If you were to describe my way of life, especially my making Christ known, courageous wouldn't make the list. You'd more likely choose words like cautious or careful, maybe even cowardly. In our passage today, we find Paul in yet another difficult and dangerous situation. And we might be expecting him to courageously step up to the plate again. But surprisingly, we don't see much of the courage of Paul in this passage. In fact, we don't see much of Paul at all in this passage. Instead, we're shown things that are meant to encourage believers like us to take courage, just like Jesus said. Because what God shows us in this passage is that we live in a world where he is actually in control. A world where God doesn't just have purposes and plans and intentions which may or may not happen. Purposes, plans, intentions that depend on circumstances outside of his control. Now, God shows us that we live in a world where he has purposes and plans and intentions, and he makes them happen. He makes progress towards them in whatever way he chooses. And it's this control, this sovereignty of God, that's one of the sources of courage for Paul and for all believers, for each of us as we make Christ known. Our courage in the Christian life and our courage in making Christ known comes from our certainty in the sovereignty of God. And if our courage to make Christ known was an engine, then what we see in this passage is the fuel that we need to get our courage started and to keep it running. We are encouraged by the knowledge that God is at work, fulfilling his purposes here, to have Paul testify about Jesus, not just in Jerusalem, but also in Rome. We'll look at the passage in two parts. First, God's purposes opposed by the plot to kill Paul, and then second, God's purposes progressed through those who rescue Paul. So first, God's purposes opposed. As we pick things up where we left off last week, Paul's still in Jerusalem. The Jews are still opposing him. Last week we saw the failed attempts by the Sanhedrin, the Jewish religious leadership, to have Paul condemned in public. They couldn't believe that Paul was doing God's will. They couldn't stomach the simple truth that Jesus had risen from the dead. And for the second time in as many chapters, they turned violent. So violent that the commander was afraid that Paul would be torn to pieces by them. And so the commander had ordered the troops to take Paul away and then take him into the barracks. And that's where Jesus stood near Paul and said, "Take courage. As you've testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." And then we come to today's passage, because following their failure to push Paul out of the picture in public, some Jews have now put their heads together. They hatch a plan to kill Paul in private, preventing Paul from testifying anymore to anyone, anywhere. And we read this in verses 12 and 13. The next morning, some Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves with an oath not to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. More than 40 men were involved in this plot. Now, this shows us just how determined some Jews are to permanently deal with Paul, and just how dangerous staying in Jerusalem has become for Paul. These Jews bind themselves with an oath. They make as serious a promise as you can make. They promise to deprive their bodies of what they need to live until Paul is dead, which is just as serious as it sounds. At that time, people could go without food and drink for religious reasons. They do it to express their dependence on God, to accompany a time of repentance or spiritual refreshment or reverent prayer. That's why people would go without food and water. But to go without food or water or drink for this purpose is extraordinary. For 40 people to fast for this purpose of killing Paul is extraordinary. Now, I know there are people who think I'm a goose. I'm okay with that. To be honest, they're probably right. And there are definitely people who don't agree with what I think. There might even be people who genuinely don't like me. But I'd be very surprised if even those who don't like me would want me to be harmed, would want me to be hit by a bus. Which just goes to show the seriousness of this kind of plot, the next level dedication of Paul's opponents. They want him dead this badly. And this shows us the danger that Paul now faces from them. As we keep reading the dedication of Paul's opponents, the danger to Paul becomes even greater. Because these 40 people, the fasting 40 if you like, they don't just take it upon themselves to put their murderous plan into action. They use their oath to then get assistance for Paul's assassination, to get assistance from the Jewish religious leaders. This is verse 14. They went to the chief priests and the elders and said, "We have taken a solemn oath not to eat anything until we have killed Paul. Now then, you and the Sanhedrin petition the commander to bring him before you on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about his case. We are ready to kill him before he gets here." So this is the plan put forward by the fasting 40. They want the whole Jewish religious leadership to petition the commander to bring Paul out to them. And while he's on the way, ambush time. You imagine how appealing this plot would sound to the religious leaders. Because up till now, they appear to be out of options. Public trials haven't worked. Paul's now protected in the barracks. He's not preaching in public, but he's persuaded Pharisees. And so this perfect plot now presents itself. Gives them a way to get rid of Paul without being directly involved. A way of having Paul killed without getting any blood on their hands. And what's incredible too is that the pretext of this plot is the pursuit of justice. They know the commander wants justice to be done, that he wants Paul to be treated fairly, that he wants more accurate information about the case. And the fasting 40 want to play on the commander's desire for justice to bring about a great injustice. They want the religious leaders to secretly support that injustice, to give up on judicial process, to give up on hearing from Paul or weighing evidence, to give up on seeing the matter resolved through any court. Instead, the religious leaders are invited to use their power to set injustice in motion so that Paul might be unjustly murdered in private. And we see that this is exactly what the religious leaders are willing to do. And what's happening behind Paul's back here is truly terrifying. Unjust leadership, inspired by the fasting 40, puts Paul in real danger of death. If ever there was a time to take Jesus' words on board, to take courage, this is it. But it's right here, under unjust leadership, inspired by the fasting 40, that we see something else. Instead of Paul's courage, we see God working. And it's here that we find a reason to take courage, as we see God's purposes progressed. That's our second point. Now, it's worth saying at this point that we come to the plot knowing that Paul's been here before. He's been under this kind of threat before. People have plotted to kill Paul at least 3 times in Acts, and each time he's been rescued. But this time, the writer of Acts slows things right down for us. He slows things down, unpacks the details to help us appreciate what's unique about this rescue. We're helped to see the people who God involved here. And we're helped to see the responses that God enabled these people to have. Now, in each of the 3 plots to kill Paul that we've seen so far in Acts, it was either Paul or other believers who found out about the plot, who took action. It was either Paul or other believers who then protected Paul from the plot, who put Paul out of harm's way. But notice who's involved here. Notice who God works through to bring about this rescue. Well, it's Paul's relative, the son of Paul's sister, and it's 3 Romans. The Roman centurion, the Roman commander Claudius Lysias, and the Roman governor Felix. This unusual group are the ones who are involved, who God works through to bring about this rescue. And then as each of them receive information, receive requests, they could have had a range of responses. But the responses they make are the ones that benefit Paul, that enable his rescue. We'll concentrate on just 2 of those responses, 2 of those people, Paul's nephew and the Roman commander. And we see the God-enabled response of Paul's nephew in verse 16. But when the son of Paul's sister heard of this plot, he went into the barracks and told Paul. Now, this is just fascinating by itself, isn't it? It's the first time in Acts that we've heard any mention of any member of Paul's family. We find out that not only does Paul have a sister and she has a son, Paul's nephew, but this nephew was somehow able to hear the plot about his uncle Paul. And we might have a whole heap of follow-up questions about this nephew. I know I do. But the important thing that we're told is what he does with that information. Imagine what it would be like for him. 40 of your own Jewish people, your fellow Jews, have committed to killing your uncle. And the Jewish leadership, the power brokers, are on board with it. They're actively pulling strings to put that murder into motion. And you know about it. And you want to do something about it. But every option you could take is genuinely dangerous, life-threatening. You can imagine him thinking, what will they do to me if they know I'm related to Paul? If they know that I was visiting Paul? If they know that I passed their plot on to Paul? What will they do if they find out I've spoken to the Romans? What if Paul or the Romans don't believe me anyway? It's incredible that Paul's nephew actually goes into the barracks and tells Paul the plot. And at Paul's instruction, he's then taken by the centurion, and both before and after the commander hears what Paul's nephew has to say, he treats him well. Far better than you'd expect a commander to treat someone sent by a prisoner. And so this is where we pick up in verse 19. The commander took the young man by the hand, drew him aside and asked, "What is it you want to tell me?" He said, "Some Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul before the Sanhedrin tomorrow on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about him. Don't give in to them, because more than 40 of them are waiting in ambush for him. They've taken an oath not to eat or drink until they have killed him. They are ready now, waiting for your consent to their request." And the commander dismissed the young man with this warning, "Don't tell anyone that you've reported this to me." So we move from the response of Paul's nephew going in, speaking the truth about this plot despite the risk. And then we turn to see the God-enabled response of the commander to this plot against Paul after receiving this information. The commander that hears the plot from Paul's nephew is the same commander who we've seen over the past couple of weeks, over the last couple of chapters. And he's already rescued Paul on at least 2 occasions. He's rescued him from the violent Jewish mob in chapter 21. He's rescued him from the violent religious leaders earlier in chapter 23. But even after those rescues, the commander's response to the plot against Paul is remarkable. We see that the Roman commander does everything in his power to secure Paul's safety, to protect Paul, to enable his safe passage away from the ambush in Jerusalem. This is verse 23. Then he, that's the commander, called 2 of his centurions and ordered them, "Get ready a detachment of 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at 9 tonight. Provide horses for Paul, so that he may be taken safely to Governor Felix. Just to put this in perspective, the threat against Paul was how many? 40. The fasting 40. And when the Roman commander becomes aware of the plot, he sends Paul away with how many? How's your maths? 470 military personnel, 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, 200 spearmen. Now, it's estimated that this force was somewhere between a third and a half of the total number of military units posted in Jerusalem. And they're sent to secure the safety of just one man, Paul. Now, as we see the response of the commander, I think it makes us like him even more. He uses so much of his political and military might to protect Paul, to get him out of the city. But it's also worth saying that the commander is also a complex character with mixed motivations. We're shown that he might have had his own reasons for what he did. He treated this way at least partly to show off to the governor, to show that these are the lengths he would go to protect life and seek justice for a Roman citizen. And this mixed motive is exposed by the letter he sends to Governor Felix. He starts his letter like this in verse 30. I think it's verse 26. He says, Claudius Lysias, to His Excellency Governor Felix, greetings. This man, Paul, was seized by the Jews, and they were about to kill him. But I came with my troops and rescued him, for I had learned that he is a Roman citizen. Now, it's a curious description of what has happened, isn't it? Because from Luke's account of these events in Acts, we know that Paul was seized by the Jews. That's right. The Jews were about to kill him. That's right. And we know that the commander did come with his troops and rescue Paul. That's right too. But when did the commander find out that Paul was a Roman citizen? Well, we know that the commander only found that out when Paul was stretched out to be flogged, when Paul spoke to the centurion who was ordered by the commander to flog him, when Paul said, "Is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't even been found guilty?" So it's true to say that Paul was rescued from the unjust Jews. But it's also true to say that Paul was rescued by a complicated Roman commander, someone who had ignored his own indiscretions, who had glossed over his guilt, who had tweaked the truth, so that he would come across as a great defender of Rome to Governor Felix. But here's the surprising thing. At the end of the day, whatever mixed motivations were in play for the commander, God chose to work through him to rescue Paul. And the response that the commander makes, however complicated, was brought about by God to benefit Paul, to enable his rescue. A rescue that sees the soldiers carrying out the commander's orders, taking Paul with them through the night out of Jerusalem, away from the assassins to Antipatris. A rescue that sees the cavalry carry out the commander's orders, taking Paul to Caesarea, handing Paul over to the governor along with the letter. It's a rescue that sees the governor ordering Paul to now be kept under guard, waiting for his accusers in Herod's palace, secure. Now, as I've thought about this passage this week, I've wondered what it would be like for Paul to see this all play out. For him to hear about the plot to kill him from his nephew, to see the responses of his nephew, then the centurion, then the commander, and finally the governor. For Paul to know the intentions of the Jews to assassinate him by pleading for him to be brought before the Sanhedrin. Then he finds himself journeying out of Jerusalem, mounted on horseback, surrounded by hundreds of soldiers and spearmen and horsemen. For Paul to have all this happen after he'd been told by Jesus to take courage, that he would testify in Rome just as he had in Jerusalem. I can imagine Paul shaking his head in amazement and thanksgiving, not only because he'd been rescued, but because he was now that much closer to testifying in Rome. And you know what? There are times when I find myself doing the same thing, shaking my head in amazement and thanksgiving, as I see that week in and week out, God is at work making Christ known. That year in and year out, we get to glimpse a small part of his work. People we've been praying for show up here, come along to services, come along to alternatives. And we get to see and hear and share in God's work in their lives. And people we haven't been praying for specifically also show up. And we get to see and hear and share in God's work in their lives too. But so often I know I forget to file these glimpses away. I forget that God is at work. And I get discouraged as I look at my making Christ known names. In the couple of weeks since you wrote down your names, you might have become aware of the difficulty. You might already be feeling a bit discouraged or deflated or defeated. But what we've been shown in this passage is that we live in a world where God is actually in control, where God doesn't just have plans and purposes and intentions which may or may not happen, which depend on circumstances outside of his control. No, we live in a world where God has purposes and plans and intentions, and he makes them happen. He makes progress in whatever way he chooses. He makes progress through opposition and difficulty and the plots of humanity. He makes progress through a relative, through a string of Roman rulers, even those with mixed motives. And we can take courage in this. We can take courage in the Christian life. We can take courage in making Christ known because of what God has shown us here. Knowing that our God is always at work. And he could make Christ known any way he chooses. Often through us, sometimes through more than one of us, and sometimes without us, leaving us shaking our heads in amazement and thanksgiving. But however he chooses to achieve his purposes, whenever we see his purposes progress, we can take courage in the certain sovereignty of God. Let me lead us in prayer before we sing. Sovereign Lord, you made the heavens and the earth and the sea and everything in them. And you spoke by your Holy Spirit through your servant David when he wrote, "Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain?" Father, thank you that even when your purposes are opposed by people, even when we are weak and fearful, Father, thank you that you are at work, bringing about what you have decided will happen. Father, please help us to take courage in the certainty of your sovereignty so that we will live fearlessly for you, boldly speak the truth about your Son, and prayerfully seeking to see your hand at work in those we know and love this year. It's in Jesus' name and for his glory that we ask these things. Amen.